A warm welcome to our viewers here in Nigeria and around the world. You're watching The World Today. I'm Amarachi Ubani. Here's what's coming up on the program. Leaders begin to arrive in Saudi Arabia for the proposed U.S. peace talks on Ukraine as Europe tries to gain some stability on the war. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres appeals for a two-state solution to the Israeli war in Gaza. Plus, at least 10 people are killed following a gas explosion in Egypt. Let's begin The World Today. European leaders are arriving at the French President's Elysee Palace for what has now become an impromptu security meeting to discuss the war in Ukraine. The meeting was announced by the French President Emmanuel Macron on Sunday after the U.S. said it would be holding talks with Russia and Ukraine in Saudi Arabia this week. The meeting will be attended by the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer and representatives from Germany, Italy, Poland, Spain, Denmark and the EU Council. The UK has been signaling it wants to be part of the Ukraine solution. Prime Minister Keir Starmer said this morning Britain is willing to deploy peacekeeping troops to Ukraine if and when the war ends. The French presidency has stressed that this first round of consultation talks should not be over-dramatized, but it comes at the moment when Europe is seeking to address a sharp change in the U.S. approach to Ukraine. Notably absent from the meeting in France is the United States as Secretary of State Marco Rubio arrives in Saudi Arabia for the talks with Russian and Ukrainian officials. The U.S. and Russia confirmed they will be in Saudi Arabia for the talks and have arrived in the country. They will be meeting tomorrow, however, in the Saudi capital Riyadh in an effort to lay groundwork for the peace talks. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky said Ukraine would not take part in the Saudi-based talks or recognize any potential agreement reached in Kyiv's absence. But he said he will visit Saudi Arabia separately on Wednesday, and he plans to ask the Saudi Crown Prince for updates on the talks. Turkish officials said Zelensky would visit Turkey on Tuesday upon the invitation of President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Meanwhile, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has asked why Europe would be invited to join possible talks on a peace settlement in Ukraine if European politicians want the war to carry on. He was addressing a press conference with his Serbian counterpart ahead of the US-Russia talks in Saudi Arabia. Lavrov said that Europe had already had several chances to be involved in a settlement on Ukraine and that he did not know how European states would contribute if they were invited to the negotiating table, given their stance on the war. The veteran foreign minister argued that Brussels had failed to help bring a resolution to the conflict since 2014, when Moscow first annexed the Crimean Peninsula and backed separatist forces in eastern Ukraine. Washington insists it wants both Russia and Ukraine to make concessions if ceasefire talks ever materialize. In the meantime, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says he will not be attending the Russia-US talks. He said that earlier this week. A source within the government had said on Sunday Ukraine had not been invited and will not be sending a delegation. It comes as President Zelensky has repeatedly said he will not attend any deals struck without his country's input. The messaging from the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky comes as the French President Emmanuel Macron's government announced on Sunday France will be hosting an emergency meeting of European leaders on Monday, warning the summit should not be over-dramatized. European governments fear the White House could strike a deal with Russia, which damages security on the continent.
President Zelensky, we had a number of fruitful conversations, a number of things for us to follow up.
Ukraine has been the topic of discussion from the NATO meeting of defense ministers. to the security summit in Munich over the weekend, following which President Zelensky voiced his resolve not to accept any peace talks Ukraine is not a part of.
Ukraine will never accept deals made behind our backs without our involvement. And the same rule should apply to all of Europe. No decisions about Ukraine without Ukraine, no decisions about Europe without Europe. Look at what Putin is trying to do now. This is his game. Putin wants one-on-one talks with America. Just like before the war, when they met in Switzerland and looked like to carve up the world. Next, Putin will try to get the US president standing on Red Square on May 9th this year, not as a respected leader, but as a prop in his own performance.
The U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has shared on the upcoming peace talks with Russia in Saudi Arabia, confirming he will be attending the Saudi Arabia talks with Russia alongside Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff and National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, two of Trump's closest foreign policy advisors.
It's great to welcome you in Jerusalem.
Earlier, he was in Jerusalem, where he held talks with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on Sunday. He gave very few details when asked about the Saudi Arabia summit, but said the next few days will determine if Vladimir Putin is serious about peace.
The threat that I worry the most about vis-a-vis Europe is not...
The U.S. approach to the war in Ukraine under the Trump administration has come under the spotlight within and outside the United States. U.S. top Democrat Jeanne Shaheen says it is vital for the U.S. to hold the Russian president accountable for the war. She also says lawmakers may soon make statements about bipartisan law allowing the U.S. to seize Russian assets and hand them over to Ukraine, saying these could be used for rebuilding as well as in the war. And former UK Prime Minister John Major has criticized Trump's decision to reach out to Russia for talks, calling the situation fairly unprecedented. Well, the Ukrainian president may not be in Saudi Arabia as we speak, but he is in the United Arab Emirates, where he's meeting with President Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan in Abu Dhabi, beg your pardon, ahead of the much-anticipated meeting holding between the U.S. and Russia this week. Delegation, including Defense Minister Rostem Umerov and First Deputy Prime Minister Yulia Sviridenko, were seen shaking hands with Mohammed bin Zayed and Emirati officials. Later, both sides are seen in a meeting and signing a memorandum. On Sunday, U.S. President Donald Trump had said he could meet with the Russian president this week in Riyadh for talks. On the same day, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio held a phone call with talks between officials on Ukraine set for Saudi Arabia this week. While the U.S. has suggested Ukraine would be involved, but not Europe, Volodymyr Zelensky insists his country has not been invited to Saudi Arabia. International affairs analyst and senior policy analyst in Alberta, Canada, Dr. Francis Opaleke, says the U.S. president has an ambitious plan of resolving the long war in Europe and that parties involved should be focused on resolving the crisis. He was speaking on our foreign affairs program, Diplomatic Channel.
What Ukraine essentially is really pushing for is, look, we want our territories back. We're not going to back up any of those territories. And this is not something you just, with a sweep of a finger or by making deal behind the aggressor, with the aggressor, a kind of signal that you're actually in alliance or kind of trying to have a much more peaceful accord with the other side here being Ukraine. So by and large, the phone call that did happen February 12th, in many instances, of course, did not really kind of go down well with Ukraine. And of course, the leader, Ukrainian leader did mention, as Zelensky did mention, that there can be no talks about lasting peace between the two countries without Ukraine being on the same table as Russia in terms of these conversations. I think which were the J.D. Vance speech, the Vice President of the United States, did come up very strongly in terms of what he wanted America to do in terms of their posturing in NATO and, of course, by and large in Europe. But you could clearly see that European leaders also rallied around Ukraine to kind of rally out their support. Now, there are prognostications, at least if you can extrapolate that from the speech given by J.D. Vance, that America is trying to take an American-first approach, putting the interests of America first. In his famous speech, he did mention, of course, which was a combative speech for such a high-level delegation conference, that a new sheriff was in town, and the new sheriff he had been of course, the new president of America, Donald Trump, is now in town and is no longer business as usual, essentially propagating the ideas of an American-first doctrine in terms of his version of his foreign policy. It's just essentially just saying America is going to be looking very carefully in terms of how it went about setting multilateral agreements, went about, dealing essentially the act of the deal with other countries. Now, for Ukraine, I think that's a very big concern because America gives nothing less than, has given so far, 69.6 billion to the Ukrainian war since it started. And I think there's a lot of money that Ukraine wouldn't want to get off the table. And essentially, of course, think about the military aid, the support America also gives to back up Ukraine and just kind of stopping Russian expansionism into its territories. So essentially, even while that went on and that kind of puts Ukraine on the back burner, a number of leaders from other countries like France backed Ukraine. Of course, Poland as well. The finance minister also made statements in the regard that, hey, look, there can be no lasting peace in Europe without Ukraine not being on the table as well. And of course, speeches from the Ukrainian leader also kind of mentioned the fact that there can be no peace talks that takes out Ukraine from the equation by and large. So I think Ukraine did get the spotlight. Not the kind of spotlight it would have envisaged it would have gotten ab initio, but at least we had prediction that this is where things were going to be tilting since Donald Trump has come into the helm of affairs and, of course, plays a very strategic leadership role in NATO and conversation relating to this. So I think it's more or less a balanced exposure that Ukraine got. But if you want to just kind of belly down, the fact that there was just that balance from other European leaders still signaling support for Ukraine to still join NATO, to still join the EU, I beg your pardon. I think that's something we can also kind of say that Ukraine still got that very good limelight to keep forging ahead. I don't think European leaders will back out from supporting Ukraine in the meantime. And I just hope that no matter the peace deal that comes up later on down the tracks, vis-a-vis the talks that is ongoing right now, that Ukraine will still be part of that grand equation in terms of the solution down the line to bring about lasting peace in the region right now. My submission is this: any conversation regarding lasting peace requires Russia and Ukraine being on the same table, having that conversation, seeking a much more diplomatic route that tells both nations to down the tools and see how more equanimity can be restored between both nations. Of course, America brings a lot of money to the table, and of course can really bring Russia to the Ukraine to the table, I beg your pardon, to be able to have these conversations with Russia. But it's not something that is going to happen overnight. This might take a phased approach where both nations are willing to just kind of down their tools and strategically restore peace and, of course, trust again between both countries. But it's not an overnight phenomenon. Both countries need to come to that kind of very solid place to kind of that this needs to happen sooner rather than later.
I encourage you to watch Dr. Okaleke's full interview. It airs tonight at 8:30 p.m. on Sky 515 if you're in the UK, and at 11:30 p.m. here in Nigeria, or watch online at both times. Adding his voice to the discussion on the war in Ukraine is mediation and peace-building practice expert and former UN Senior Mediation Advisor Emmanuel Habuka Bombade. He says things went wrong for the Ukrainian president when he allowed himself to be dictated to by the West.
Back even to Trump made several indications, going back even to his political campaigns to be elected as president, that he wants to stand for world peace, and that he will shift the paradigm and reach out and allow dialogue, particularly with Russia, to prevail, and in that regard respond to the specific issue that we're talking about, which is the conflict and the war between Russia and Ukraine. And so for me, I was not surprised that we started to hear the indications that he was going to reach out to Moscow, he was going to talk to President Putin, and then came the news conference that he actually spoke for more than an hour with President Putin, and he also spoke with President Zelensky. I'm happy that at the end of the day, Africa's position is beginning to prevail, that it is only through dialogue that the Russia-Ukraine war will end, but I hope it will be the opening to redefine global cooperation, that we must demilitarize our minds and our approaches to conflict prevention and move towards preventive diplomacy and dialogue. You cannot continue to put so much of the wealth of this planet in military weapons as the answer to problems that can be resolved through dialogue. And I think that we need to emphasize that. And I think this is where you can appreciate that the role of Saudi Arabia as a facilitator can urge, can nudge forward, can create the environment for these initial steps to then evolve and mature into something tangible. And at the end of the day, as I have stated, it will be for our common good, it will be for the good of humanity, and to that extent, peace in the world.
Our Washington correspondent Maria Bird is monitoring developments from Washington. She joins us now. Maria, thanks for joining us on the program. Walk us through the expectations for these talks in Saudi Arabia.
Well, the president has been very clear about his goal for the U.S. to occupy Gaza. And so that is, I think, at the core of these conversations. Obviously, we also know that there are peace talks around Ukraine and Russia, and that there are immediate talks between the Russia and U.S., and that Russia seems to be very much in alignment with the president. And so it is a very interesting type of experience that I think is getting ready to happen, what we're going to see through Marco Rubio as he is there leading the delegation for the United States and going forth and seeing that him and Netanyahu are on the same page with the U.S. Being able to secure, and most importantly, I think, the peace in the Middle East. Now, the question is, Saudi Arabia has not necessarily been in favor of what the president has been discussing. And so Marco Rubio today is going to be very clear in working with Saudi Arabia to see if they can come to terms with what the U.S. is proposing. Obviously, there's major concerns around what does this mean for those Palestinians who could be displaced, those who are not of threat, that have been displaced, that have been dealing with poverty challenges, that have been victims of this war. And so I think that is really going to be the question and concern for many as we look to see how this potential peace talks. We know that the European Union has also come together to discuss what this could mean. This is a major day for world peace talks. Obviously, it's greater than just exactly what's happening right there in Gaza, but as we also know, this is also addressing the Ukraine and Russia war as well.
Indeed, and that's probably why, these talks are holding in Saudi Arabia, because I did wonder about the location for these talks. Saudi Arabia is not a democracy, interestingly enough. It is a kingdom where there is no, there are no indicators of power, indicators of government or otherwise. So why would this be the center, the location for talks about Russia and Ukraine? It's understandable, when you talk about the war in Gaza, but why discuss with Russia and Ukraine in Saudi Arabia?
Well, there has obviously been support from Russia for what the U.S. is proposing to do with Gaza. And so that is kind of how Russia has gotten to play with this. And obviously, Ukraine at this time does not have the same level of potential support from the U.S. as it did in the previous administration. And so they are trying to find ways to ensure, if possible, sovereignty for their country. They do understand the U.S. has been a major player within the Russia-U.S. war since the beginning. And so this is a time for them to find ways to ensure that they can too find a ways, if they can be a sovereign nation, and to be able to ensure that they're able to capitalize as much as possible. So the U.S. is definitely in the middle of this, and I think this is U.S.-led as it relates to that. As you mentioned earlier, Saudi Arabia is a kingdom, and so that makes it very interesting as well, as we also look at the way in which the U.S. Has been governed in just less than 30 days and some of the executive orders and the way in which the Trump administration has moved forward. So this is, I think, something that's much larger than what we have traditionally seen of how these two issues, global issues, have been addressed. Obviously, the war against Russia and Ukraine has definitely been dealt separately, typically with the U.S., and obviously the challenges between Palestine and Israel have been dealt separately. But this administration has decided to bring them together as a way to potentially tackle two major issues within one agreement, or potentially an agreement that addresses two very major global concerns.
So I do see a lot of U.S. Attention focused on Russia and with the Russian president, but not on the Ukrainian part. It appears that the main discussion is holding with Russia, but Ukraine has been invited as an addendum, I guess. Even though the war is happening in Ukraine, President Volodymyr Zelensky is not happy about that. He says no agreement can be made in Ukraine's absence. How does the U.S. remedy this situation it is in with Ukraine right now?
Well, the U.S., and you've heard Russia state that they are trying to amend and to increase the relationship and the ties between the U.S. and Russia. That has been obviously very clear. There's a different strategy toward how to address the Russia-Ukraine war with this new administration. And so obviously there's been greater conversation between U.S. and Russia than necessarily Ukraine and the United States. And I think the president understands that, and President Zelensky of Ukraine definitely understands that as well, which is why, as you mentioned, kind of an addendum to this, and trying to ensure that whatever agreements are made, that they are made to include Ukraine. And as we know, the more countries that are in alignment, the more pressure that's put on the other party. And so I think part of what we're seeing here is trying to galvanize a coalition to be able to move forward with the current agenda, to ensure that agenda is actually seen to fruition, and then obviously putting pressure on those other countries to fall in line.
Maria, thanks again for joining us. Welcome back. Since Donald Trump took over office in the United States, there have been concerns regarding American policies towards Africa as a flurry of other policies affect U.S. relations with countries. One of those initiatives by the American government is the African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA. The concern stems from Trump's latest spat with South Africa, which had incurred Trump's disdain for its allegation of human rights violations against Palestinians by Israel. On February 11, 2025, Republican Congressman Andrew Ogles, Tom Tiffany, Joe Wilson, and Don Bacon said South Africa had a vendetta against Israel, was allegedly committing human rights violations, and was friendly with China's Communist Party. The letter read, "We urge you to revoke South Africa's preference benefits under the African Growth and Opportunity Act." The letter, signed by the 4 congressmen, says we would also suggest that you consider suspending diplomatic ties unless that government is prepared to engage constructively with our own. President Trump, backed by Tesla CEO Elon Musk, has falsely accused the South African government of mistreating Afrikaners and white farmers as it tries to reform land ownership in a country where they own more than 3/4 of land, although they make up less than 10% of the population. No farm has been forcibly taken in South Africa since democracy began in 1994. South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa, who heads a 10-member government of national unity, has said he will send ministers to address the U.S. concerns, but has insisted that South Africa will not be bullied. The U.S. has been unhappy that South Africa took Israel to the International Court of Justice, accusing it of genocide over military offensive in Gaza, where tens of thousands have been killed. Israel has denied the charge, saying it defended itself after Hamas attacked it on October 7, 2023. I want to bring in now foreign policy commentator Collins Weke. He's in Brussels to discuss this. Collins, great to have you on the show. And I'm sure that you're just as keen to know whether American trade with Africa will diminish or increase under the U.S. president. So let me ask you straight. Do you think AGOA will be one of the casualties of Trump's isolationist policies?
Thank you, Amarachi, for having me. Always a pleasure. Well, it is inevitable that indeed the reforms that President Trump is instituting, one of which is, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, is going to have impact not only on Africa, but also on United States of America itself. Now, you did mention South Africa in your intro. Yes, the impact is actually going to be moderate on South Africa because a recent study that was released actually indicated that the impact on the GDP of South Africa is going to be somewhere around 0.06%. Now, on some specific, sectors, for instance, agriculture, yes, it will have, huge impact. But of course, it's going to be compensated by South Africa's diversification, because they are not exporting only to United States of America. We also have to understand that the AGOA does not, affect, for instance, automotive industry. Because agriculture is the one that it impacts. So yes, I think that the impact is going to go round. It will affect United States of America, but it will also affect Africa in significant ways.
So the AGOA Act is supposed to be renewed, I think it's in September this year. And, with the way Trump is going, pulling the U.S. out of a number of international agreements, right now he's focused on Europe, trying to get them to face the war on the continent, which is the war in Ukraine. He's trying to rule out every distraction to his government at this time. These are things he had said before he came into office as president. Do you think AGOA will be done away with by this U.S. administration?
Well, what we have seen, from Donald Trump's actions so far, and of course in his first coming as president, is the fact that his foreign policy approach is unconventional, rather unorthodox. But you see, at the heart of every foreign policy, be it that of Trump or other U.S. president, or indeed any democracy in the world, is that foreign policy is a tool for national and security interests. Now, the difference between Trump and other presidents, be it United States or other parts of the world, actually has to do with the individual president's political leaning and to some extent his, or her, character. Now, in the case of Donald Trump, what we are seeing is that he is not interested in bilateral or multilateralism. He is much more interested in reciprocal kind of relationship whereby AGOA at the moment is seen to be benefiting only the African countries, but not quite United States of America. So he wants to see a give and take sort of relationship. And so, it could well be that, yes, they will meet, each other somewhere in the middle. It could also be that other countries, Europe, other continents or countries within Europe take advantage of the end of AGOA or potential end of AGOA, because we still have to see what happens in September, to boost their trade relations with Africa, and so leaving America in this instance high and dry.
So one of the purposes of AGOA is to assist economies of sub-Saharan Africa and to improve economic relations between the United States and the region. We're talking about South Africa today because of what the Trump administration said last week over those policies by the South African government to retrieve, there's something they call it, forgot the name now, retrieve lands from white farmers and give them over to black farmers. I'm sure that's not what it is exactly, because I think I've heard South African media explain it as this will be land that is fertile, that is not in use, that has been lying dormant for a number of years. So it's not particularly seizing lands from white farmers. It is really taking land that has not been used and then, repurposing it for the government and to people who could use it better. But the purpose, this is basically the main U.S. foreign policy towards Africa that really ties both the continent to the United States. Trade is one of the biggest policies that, both sides can ever leverage on. Why would Trump want to hurt that?
Well, he hasn't hurt it yet. He has made announcements. It could very well be a threat. It could be, because we've seen this happen with Trump in the past, that, he makes a statement to shake the table, and by doing that, he kind of plants fear in the eyes of the negotiating power, by which strategy he tries to strengthen his negotiating position, and ultimately they find a common ground. So this might be more of a strategy rather than actually meaning to put an end to AGOA, because the key question here is it's going to affect prices in America. It's going to lead to job losses in the United States of America, and then a very serious supply chain disruption, not only globally but also in the United States. So somehow, what is missing from importation from Africa would have to be filled up from somewhere, and where exactly, neither Trump himself nor his advisors know at this moment. So essentially, I believe that there will be a negotiated settlement here. From what we have heard, the South African president Ramaphosa, talk about. He would not have America or any country for that matter intimidate South Africa, because, as you know, Amarachi, we are talking about BRICS. Russia, Turkey, and the rest of them are making very strong incursion into Africa, presenting America a run for its money. So you ask yourself, under this circumstance, is that when America should be, withdrawing rather than, boosting trade with some of these African countries and the rest of the world?
So I wish you'd talk a bit more, about what opportunities this leaves for Europe, for European countries. I know the Belgian authorities, where you are trying to make some inroads into Africa with holding, business summits. I think there's a business summit coming up, I'm not sure now, sometime in Belgium. What is the opportunity that this leaves for countries like Belgium?
I'm happy you asked that question, Amarachi, because obviously, African businesses are very much, have been very much unaware of opportunities, trade and investment opportunities out here in Belgium and Luxembourg. So what we have tried to do within, the Nigeria, Belgium, Luxembourg Business Forum, and this has been ongoing for the past 3 years, is creating opportunity for businesses in Nigeria and those out here in Belgium and Luxembourg to interface. And by doing that, they are discovering themselves. And it is no surprise that, about a week or two ago, the, executives of Nigeria Export Promotion Council actually announced that in 2024, the growth in non-oil exports, in Nigeria is about, as a matter of fact, more than 20%. Now, this is down to some of these, arrangements that have been made, trade facilitation process. And like you mentioned, there's going to be a business forum that will take place out here in Brussels in October. Preparatory to that, in April, we're going to be in town in Lagos and Abuja to actually, mobilize support and interest for the trade. So you see, what that means essentially is that as we are doing that, other European countries are doing similar things, thereby, diversifying the market, creating opportunities for Nigerian businesses. And so it is an easy walkover when AGOA stalls, because that door closes, other doors in Europe and elsewhere opens for Nigerian and African businesses.
Collins, thank you so much for explaining this and breaking it down for us on The World Today.
Always a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
The United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres has urged for hostilities to be avoided at all costs as the Gaza ceasefire agreement continues. He was making the comment during a speech at the just concluded African Union Summit in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia on Saturday. During his speech, he also acknowledged the humanitarian crisis in Sudan as the ongoing conflict has forced more than 10.7 million people to flee their homes, including 1.8 million people who've left the country, making it the highest displacement rate globally.
As we gather here in Africa, I know all our minds are also very much on Gaza. A resumption of hostilities must be avoided at all costs. The Palestinian people have suffered too much. I welcome efforts by the parties to abide by the ceasefire agreement and urge action for a permanent ceasefire and the release of all hostages. Peace is possible in the Middle East, and that starts with tangible, irreversible and permanent progress towards the two-state solution, Israel and Palestine living side by side in peace and security.
We'll be returning to Africa shortly, but at least 9 people died over the weekend as torrential rains drenched parts of southeastern United States, submerging roads and homes. Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear said 8 people had died in his state and suggested at a news conference on Sunday the total could go up. Hundreds of people stranded in floodwaters, many stuck in their cars, had been rescued. According to Beshear, he warned residents to stay off the roads and stay alive. Over in Georgia, the 9th death was recorded after a man lying in his bed was struck by an uprooted tree that crashed into his home. Welcome back to The World Today. The United Arab Emirates has pledged an additional $200 million in humanitarian aid for Sudan during a press conference with the African Union and the Intergovernmental Authority on Development and others in Ethiopia. Now, so far, the UAE has provided over $400 million to support the Sudanese people and neighboring countries who welcome Sudanese refugees. The UAE Minister of State Sheikh Nahyan Al Nahyan says this latest fund is to reaffirm the UAE's commitment to Sudan.
The UAE has provided over $400 million to support the Sudanese people in Sudan and neighboring countries who have so generously welcomed Sudanese refugees. Today, we reaffirm our commitment to the people of Sudan by announcing an additional $200 million in humanitarian funding. This support reflects our unwavering solidarity since the last decade alone. We have stood by our brothers and sisters in Sudan with $3.5 billion over the past years.
This crisis is not just Sudanese. It is a regional and a global concern, impacting lives, livelihoods, and stability across the Horn of Africa and beyond. Global solidarity is essential to ensure the Sudanese people receive food, clean water, basic health care, including vaccines and medicines, and protection against violence. As the holy month of Ramadan approaches, urgent action is required, not just in words, but through tangible commitments to elevate suffering.
Nigeria has been reacting to allegations of international agencies funding the Boko Haram terrorist group. The Chief of Defense as Standards and Evaluation, Defense Headquarters, Major General Adekunle Ariyibi, has confirmed that there is indeed international funding and external collaborators for the Boko Haram terrorist group, one of which is known is their connection with ISIS. But the Major General says the fighting threats to the nation cannot be a military operation alone. It involves society and other government agencies. He was guest in our program today, The Morning Brief.
It's obvious that the operations of Boko Haram, Islamic State in West African province has metamorphosized since their allegiance with the ISIS, and they have had access to international funding which is beyond the shores of Nigeria. It's obvious in the caliber of weapons you see them display. It's obvious in the sort of sustainability plans that they have. And right now, they are moving into drones, and not only surveillance drones, but also drones that can deliver leather weaponry. So it's obvious, and just as the CDS has said, there's no doubt and no ambiguity about that fact, that there are external collaborators and sponsors. And in 2024, you saw Nigerian governments identified and sanctioned 19 Nigerians regarding to terrorism funding. So there's no doubt about it that this is the lifeline of which is sustaining these operations beyond the local collections that they make on taxing and all of that. Fighting this existential threat to our nation, it's not a military alone function. It is something that needs to go beyond only kinetic operations. The military alone cannot go it alone. It is a whole of society approach that would resolve the issue, because there are so many lines of operation that are not military, that are not driven by military, that needs to be by federal government agencies, by ministries, departments and agencies that need to champion this cause. Right. It need not be the military that needs to be at the part of it. The military should be focusing on the kinetic part of the operation.
Reactions continue to trail the denial of visas to Nigerian senior military officials, including the head of the military, by the Canadian High Commission in Nigeria to attend an event in Vancouver, Canada. While the Nigerian government has condemned Canada for denying visas to its officials, Interior Minister Olubunmi Tunji-Ojo condemned the action by Canadian officials, terming it disrespectful. Senior policy analyst and international affairs analyst Dr. Francis Opaleke says Canada has the right or discretion to approve and issue visas to anyone.
As a matter of fact, Canada does have the right or have the discretion to determine who gets a visa approval or denial. But for the sake of General Christopher Musa, I think the level at which that denial did come in terms of the publicity was something that really kind of stoked the attention of many Nigerians. And that's simply because many Nigerians, of course, are in this Japa rush right now. And the question that will be lingering on their mind right in this instance is if someone as high as General Christopher Musa and, of course, a number of security personnel can get their visa refused, what will be the fate of many other Nigerians there as well? But I think beyond that, I think the bigger question here is the bigger question relating to the publicity of this visa refusals. And I think for Nigeria, the bigger piece will be the bilateral tension it can stoke between Nigeria and Canada at the moment. Of course, getting that response from the Nigerian security advisor, Nudu Ribadu, also kind of saying this is not a very palatable situation right now for Nigeria and Canada at this instance. So yes, it doesn't come well. It's not something that really kind of is the news you want to hear right now in terms of visa denial. And many, of course, will have many questions that will be seeking many answers in their mind at this instance.
Let's move over to Egypt, where 10 people have been killed when a building collapsed in the capital, injuring 8 more. Several others are believed to be missing under the rubble as ambulances and rescue authorities search for more victims at the scene in the working-class neighborhood of Kerdassa. Although a police investigation is underway, eyewitnesses tell the media that a gas cylinder explosion caused the collapse. Building regulations are unevenly enforced in the sprawling metropolis of Cairo, which is home to 26 million people. The city has seen several deadly building collapses in recent years, both due to the dilapidated state of some and at times failure to comply with building regulations. The Kostroma Russian National Ballet did perform in Abu Dhabi on Sunday as part of the tour of the BRICS nations. The performers putting on their national show of Russia took the audience on a journey through the history of traditions of the country at the Abu Dhabi National Theatre. The production was part of the cultural and educational project Global Dance Overture, aimed at promoting cultural ties among the BRICS countries. According to President of the Russian National Ballet, Kostroma Elena Sarenko, the language of dance transcends all borders and ethnic distinctions. The productions have been performed in 27 countries worldwide. This latest dance is the first to an Arab audience. The Global Dance Overture project is supported by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Russia and the Ministry of Culture of the Russian Federation. The program includes performances by artists, master classes and training sessions at the Kostroma Gubernia Ballet School for dancers from BRICS countries. This year, the Global Dance Overture will be held in Egypt, Saudi Arabia and in China, followed by performances in Brazil, Ethiopia, India and South Africa next year. This National Cultural Exchange Program culminated in the BRICS Folk Dance Culture Festival. We're on to setting world records. We begin with 14-year-old math whiz from India. Nashkik is holding 6 Guinness World Records on mental calculation in 1 day. Aryan Shukla shows off his calculating skills through practice drills using finger math and a computer. His world record certificates and mental calculation World Cup Championship trophies are from 2022 and 2024. Aryan shared that he began to pursue mental calculation as a career in 2016 and internationally 2 years after. He says, as one of the founding members of the Global Mental Calculation Association, he aims to showcase and propagate mental calculation to a larger audience and learn from it. The younger Shukla broke 6 Guinness World Records in various categories of mental calculation during a formal event in Dubai in December 2024, such as the fastest time to mentally add 104-digit numbers, the fastest time to mentally add 204-digit numbers, and fastest time to mentally add 55-digit numbers. The records were 30.9 seconds, 1 minute, 9.68 seconds, and 18.71 seconds. In 2022, Aryan Shukla won the Mental Calculation World Cup in Germany at the age of 12. He successfully defended his title last year.
I started doing mental calculation since 2016. I started doing practice with basic and then I improved. My parents researched and they basically guide me through this journey. In 2018, I started my international career. In these 6 records, the first record was doing 4-digit 100 numbers in 30.96 seconds.
Finally, they say love is timeless, and Brazilian couple Manuel Angelim Dino and Maria do Sousa Dino are living proof of that. A couple now 105 and 101 years respectively have been married for an incredible 84 years and 77 days to set a record for the longest marriage for a living couple. Times were very different when they tied the knot in 1940 at the Chapel of Boa Ventura in Ceará, Brazil. The first programmable electronic computer was still yet to be invented, and Brazil had not even won a single FIFA World Cup at the time. Manuel was born in 1919, Maria in 1923. They both met around 1936 while working in agriculture for their families. Manuel had traveled to the Almeida region in the Boa Viagem district to collect a shipment of traditional Brazilian candy when he made her acquaintance, but it was not until some years later that they started a relationship. In fact, the original meeting did not lead to much at all. It was only after a chance encounter around 1940 that Manuel decided Maria was a person he wanted to spend the rest of his life with, literally. So, what's the secret to a lasting marriage? According to Maria, it's her family and it's love, of course. And that's something even the most advanced computer could never calculate. Sorry, Ariane, about that. But thanks for watching The World Today. I'm Amarachi Ubani.